The key turned in the lock with the familiar metallic click that Richard Morrison had heard thousands of times before. As a landlord of 15 years, he thought he'd seen everything. Late rent, property damage, even the occasional bizarre tenant quirk. But nothing could have prepared him for what waited behind apartment 4B's door that Tuesday morning. The smell hit him first, then the sound, and finally the sight that would haunt him for months to come. What he discovered in Sarah Chen's apartment wasn't just shocking. It was the kind of revelation that would expose a web of deception so twisted it would destroy lives, end careers, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you trust the most. Richard Morrison had always prided himself on being a fair landlord. At 52, with salt and pepper hair and calloused hands that spoke of decades in property management, he owned a modest 12-unit apartment complex in the heart of Portland's Selwood neighborhood. The building, a converted 1920s warehouse with exposed brick walls and high ceilings, had been his life's work. Purchased with every penny of his inheritance after his father's death, renovated with his own sweat and savings, and maintained with the kind of meticulous attention that kept tenants happy and rent checks flowing. His daily routine was as predictable as sunrise. Every morning at 7:30, Richard would emerge from his ground-floor apartment with a steaming cup of black coffee and begin his walk-through. He'd check the mailboxes, water the small garden he'd planted by the entrance, and listen for any sounds of distress from the units above. The building had become more than an investment property. It was his community, his responsibility, and in many ways, his identity. The tenants knew him as someone who fixed problems quickly, kept rent increases reasonable, and respected their privacy. Mrs. Patterson in 2A had lived there for 8 years, always greeting him with homemade cookies and updates about her grandchildren. The young couple in 3C, both graduate students, had been there 4 years and always shoveled the walkway without being asked. Even old Mr. Kowalski in 1B, who complained about everything from the neighbors' music to the color of the hallway walls, had grudgingly admitted that Richard was one of the good ones. This sense of community had been Richard's greatest source of pride. He'd seen landlords in the neighborhood who treated their properties like ATMs, squeezing every dollar from tenants while letting buildings decay. That wasn't his way. When the furnace in 2B died in January, he'd replaced it within 24 hours, even though it meant eating ramen for 2 weeks. When Mrs. Chen in 4B had been laid off from her accounting job, he'd quietly accepted partial payments for 3 months without penalty, never mentioning it to anyone. Sarah Chen had moved into 4B 18 months ago. A soft-spoken woman in her early 30s who worked remotely as a freelance graphic designer. She'd impressed Richard during their initial meeting. Professional references, first month's rent and deposit paid in full, and a portfolio of work that suggested steady income. She'd been the ideal tenant, quiet, clean, and prompt with rent payments. Her apartment, a corner unit with large windows facing the courtyard, had always been immaculate during the few times Richard had needed to enter for maintenance. But over the past 6 months, something had shifted. The changes were subtle at first. Sarah had become increasingly reclusive, rarely emerging from her apartment even to collect mail. When they did cross paths in the hallway, her usual warm smile had been replaced by nervous glances and hurried conversations. She'd installed additional locks on her door, claiming she felt unsafe in the neighborhood. Though Selwood was one of Portland's quieter areas, the rent payments, once reliably early, had begun arriving later each month. Not late enough to warrant concern, but the pattern was noticeable. When Richard had gently inquired about her well-being during a chance encounter by the mailboxes, Sarah had assured him everything was fine. just dealing with some personal matters. Her appearance had changed too. The confident, well-dressed woman who'd toured the apartment had been replaced by someone who seemed constantly on edge, often wearing the same clothes for days at a time. Other tenants had begun mentioning strange occurrences. Mrs. Patterson reported unusual smells coming from the direction of 4B, describing them as chemical-like but not unpleasant. The graduate students in 3C had complained about intermittent humming sounds at odd hours, though they acknowledged they couldn't be certain which unit they were coming from. Mr. Kowalski, ever the building's unofficial watchman, had noted that Sarah was receiving an unusual number of packages, sometimes 3 or 4, deliveries in a single day. Richard had dismissed these observations as the natural result of a building full of people living in close quarters. Every tenant had their quirks, their private struggles, their reasons for needing space. His philosophy had always been simple. As long as rent was paid and no one was being disturbed, what people did in their own homes was their business. The building itself had been running smoothly, despite these minor mysteries. The new energy-efficient windows he'd installed the previous fall were keeping heating costs down. The updated plumbing in Units 3A and 3B had eliminated the water pressure issues that had plagued those apartments for years. His careful financial management meant he could afford these improvements without raising rents, something his tenants appreciated in a city where housing costs seemed to climb monthly. Richard's own life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. His daughter Emma, now 25 and working as a nurse in Seattle, called every Sunday evening to check in. His ex-wife Linda, with whom he'd maintained a cordial relationship since their divorce 5 years earlier, occasionally stopped by to discuss their daughter or share neighborhood gossip. He'd been casually dating Margaret, a teacher from the local elementary school. For 8 months, nothing serious but companionship that filled the quiet evenings. The property management business had given him a sense of purpose that his previous career in construction had lacked. There was something deeply satisfying about providing people with safe, affordable homes, about being the person they called when something went wrong and knowing he could fix it. His reputation in the neighborhood was solid. Other property owners sometimes sought his advice, and real estate agents regularly referred potential tenants his way. This Tuesday morning had started like any other. Richard had completed his usual walkthrough, noting that the autumn leaves needed to be cleared from the gutters and that the front door's paint was beginning to chip near the handle. He'd received a text from Emma about her new apartment in Seattle, responded to an email from a prospective tenant interested in the studio apartment that would be available next month, and scheduled a routine maintenance inspection for several units. Sarah Chen's apartment was last on his list, a standard check of the smoke detector that was required annually by city code. He'd sent her the required 48-hour notice via email and text, as he did for all tenants. Her response had been brief but normal. Tuesday at 10 a.m. works fine. Nothing in that simple exchange had suggested that what waited behind her door would shatter everything. Richard thought he knew about his tenant, his building, and the quiet life he'd built in Selwood. The first real warning sign came 3 weeks before that fateful Tuesday morning. Richard was replacing a light fixture in the second-floor hallway when he noticed the smell, a sharp, acrid odor that seemed to drift down from the upper floors. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was distinctly chemical, like the scent that lingered in his garage after he'd used paint thinner or wood stain. He'd made a mental note to check with his tenants about any home improvement projects, but the smell had dissipated by evening, and he'd forgotten about it entirely. The second incident occurred during the first week of October. Mrs. Patterson had knocked on his door at 7 in the morning. still in her bathrobe and clearly agitated. She'd been awakened by what she described as a grinding sound coming from somewhere above her apartment. Not loud enough to be construction work, she explained, but persistent and rhythmic, like machinery running. Richard had immediately gone to investigate, checking each floor systematically. But by the time he reached the 4th floor, whatever had been making the noise had stopped. Sarah's apartment was silent, and when he'd knocked gently on her door, there had been no answer. That same week, the building's water pressure had begun fluctuating inexplicably. Richard prided himself on maintaining the plumbing system meticulously, but suddenly, tenants were reporting intermittent drops in water pressure, particularly on the upper floors. The building's ancient pipes could be temperamental, but these weren't the usual complaints about old plumbing. The pressure would drop suddenly, sometimes for hours at a time, then return to normal without any apparent cause. Richard had contacted his usual plumber, but Tony Ramirez had found nothing wrong with the main lines or the pressure system. The package deliveries had escalated from unusual to bizarre. Richard had always been aware of his tenants' delivery patterns. It was part of keeping track of building security, but Sarah's packages had become a daily occurrence. More concerning was their variety: medical supply companies, chemical distributors, and industrial equipment suppliers he'd never heard of. When he'd casually asked the UPS driver about the frequent deliveries to 4B, the man had shrugged and mentioned that he'd been delivering to that address almost daily for months, sometimes multiple packages from the same sender on consecutive days. The graduate students in 3C had approached Richard with increasingly specific complaints. The humming sound Mrs. Patterson had mentioned was becoming a nightly occurrence, they reported, always starting around 11 p.m. and continuing until dawn. They'd tried recording it with their phones, but the sound was too faint to capture clearly. More disturbing were their reports of vibrations, not earthquake-like tremors, but a subtle rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come through the ceiling. They'd initially blamed it on the building's old ventilation system, but Richard knew every sound his building made, and this wasn't familiar. The smell had returned with a vengeance in mid-October, stronger and more persistent than before. This time other tenants began complaining. Mr. Kowalski described it as like a hospital mixed with a hardware store. Mrs. Patterson worried it might be a gas leak, though the gas company's emergency inspection had found nothing. The odor seemed strongest on the 4th floor, lingering in the hallway outside Sarah's apartment, but Richard couldn't identify its source. When he'd attempted to discuss it with Sarah, she'd claimed she hadn't noticed any unusual smells and suggested it might be coming from the restaurant 3 blocks away. The building's electrical system had begun showing signs of strain that made no sense to Richard's experienced eye. The circuit breakers for the 4th floor were tripping regularly, sometimes multiple times per week. Richard had upgraded the electrical panel just 2 years earlier to handle modern appliances and electronics, but suddenly the system was behaving as if it was overloaded. The electrical contractor he'd hired to investigate found no obvious problems with the wiring, but noted that something on the 4th floor was drawing significantly more power than typical residential usage would account for. Sarah's behavior had become increasingly erratic and secretive. She'd started leaving the building at odd hours. Richard had noticed her car gone at 2 in the morning and returning before dawn. Her appearance continued to deteriorate. The few times he'd seen her in the hallway, she'd looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that made their brief interactions uncomfortable. She'd stopped making eye contact entirely, and her responses to his polite inquiries about building maintenance or rent matters had become monosyllabic. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late October. Richard had been watching television when the entire building's power had flickered, then gone out completely. Emergency power had kicked in for the exit signs and emergency lighting, but every apartment had gone dark. Richard had immediately checked the main electrical panel, expecting to find a tripped main breaker, but everything appeared normal. The power company's automated system showed no outages in the area. After 15 minutes of mystified investigation, the power had simply returned, as inexplicably as it had vanished. The next morning, Richard had found scorch marks on the concrete floor of the basement, directly below Sarah's apartment. The marks were roughly circular, about the size of dinner plates, and appeared to have been caused by intense heat. There was no obvious source for the burns, no electrical equipment, no heating system components, nothing that should have been capable of generating that kind of temperature. The building's insurance inspector had been baffled, noting that the concrete itself had been damaged in a way that suggested sustained exposure to extreme heat. Richard's attempts to investigate further had been met with increasingly suspicious resistance from Sarah. When he'd requested access to her apartment to check for any electrical issues that might have caused the basement damage, she'd insisted everything was normal and refused entry beyond what was legally required for emergency situations. Her rent payments had become erratic, sometimes early, sometimes barely on time, always paid in cash now instead of the checks she'd used for her first year of tenancy. The amounts were correct, but the bills were always crisp and new, as if she was getting them directly from a bank rather than from normal circulation. Other building systems had begun failing in ways that defied explanation. The building's internet service, provided through a single cable line that served all units, had started experiencing intermittent outages that only affected the fourth floor. The cable company had replaced equipment twice, but the problem persisted. The building's water heater, a commercial-grade unit Richard had installed just 3 years earlier, had begun cycling on and off at random intervals, causing temperature fluctuations that left tenants with alternately scalding and ice-cold water. The most unsettling development had been the discovery of modified utility connections. During a routine inspection of the building's main electrical panel, Richard had noticed additional wiring that he didn't remember installing. The connections were professional-grade work, clearly done by someone with electrical expertise, but they bypassed the building's standard metering system. Someone had essentially created an unmonitored power connection, and the additional drawer explained the circuit breaker problems and the basement scorch marks. Richard's attempts to trace the unauthorized wiring had led him through the building's walls and ceiling spaces, following conduits that had been carefully concealed behind existing infrastructure. The trail led inexorably upward through each floor, terminating somewhere within the fourth floor's ceiling space. The amount of additional power being drawn was substantial, enough to run industrial equipment or high-powered electronics, far beyond what any residential tenant should need. The building's other tenants had begun approaching Richard with concerns that went beyond simple maintenance, complaints. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned seeing Sarah bringing in large containers at night, always when she thought no one was watching. The graduate students had reported strange chemical odors coming through their ventilation system, smells that made them feel dizzy and nauseous. Mr. Kowalski, despite his usual complaints, had quietly asked Richard if he thought the building was safe, admitting that he'd been considering moving for the first time in 6 years. The final straw had come just days before Richard's scheduled inspection. The building's fire alarm system had malfunctioned in a way that sent emergency responders racing to the property at 3 in the morning. The fire department had found no signs of fire, smoke, or any emergency condition, but their electronic equipment had detected elevated levels of various chemicals in the building's air system. The fire chief had recommended that Richard investigate immediately, noting that some of the detected compounds were potentially hazardous in concentrated amounts. Richard had spent the weekend researching the chemicals the fire department had identified, and what he'd learned had filled him with growing dread. Several of the compounds were used in industrial processes that had no legitimate residential applications. Others were components in manufacturing processes that required specialized equipment, proper ventilation, and hazardous material handling protocols. The combination suggested activities that were not only inappropriate for a residential building, but potentially dangerous to everyone living there. The pressure from other tenants had intensified. 3 families had given him informal notice that they were considering moving if the building's problems weren't resolved soon. Mrs. Patterson had found a new apartment and was planning to leave at the end of her lease. The graduate students had started spending most of their time at the library, returning to their apartment only to sleep. Even Mr. Kowalski had begun parking his car on the street instead of in the building's small parking area, claiming he didn't trust the building's structural integrity. Sarah's rent payment for November had been late for the first time since she'd moved in. When Richard had called to inquire, she'd been evasive and promised to have it ready within a few days. The payment, when it finally came, had been in cash as usual, but this time the bills had included several foreign currencies mixed in with the American money. Sarah had claimed it was an accounting error and quickly exchanged the foreign bills for correct payment. But the incident had raised new questions about her income sources. The unauthorized electrical work had been traced to a junction box hidden in the 4th floor's utility closet, a space that was supposed to be accessible only to Richard and authorized maintenance personnel. Someone had not only accessed this restricted area, but had performed extensive modifications that required both electrical expertise and specialized equipment. The sophistication of the work suggested professional installation, but no legitimate electrical contractor would have done such work without permits and building owner authorization. Richard's insurance company had begun asking uncomfortable questions about the building's recent problems. The frequency of unusual incidents, combined with the fire department's chemical detection report, had triggered a review that could potentially affect his coverage. The insurance inspector had recommended a comprehensive building inspection, but had also hinted that certain types of activities could void his policy entirely if they were discovered and not immediately addressed. As Tuesday morning approached, Richard had made the decision that he could no longer avoid confronting whatever was happening in apartment 4B. The scheduled smoke detector inspection would provide the legal access he needed to finally see what Sarah Chen was hiding behind her increasingly fortified door. He'd prepared for various scenarios: drug manufacturing, illegal business operations, even hoarding situations that might explain the smells and sounds. But nothing in his 15 years as a landlord, nothing in his decades of construction work, nothing in his practical, methodical approach to problem solving had prepared him for what he would actually find when that key turned in the lock. The key slid into the lock at exactly 10:03 a.m., 3 minutes later than Richard had planned, due to a last-minute phone call from his insurance company asking more probing questions about the building's recent incidents. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the key, not from nervousness about a routine inspection, but from the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The familiar click of the lock disengaging seemed unnaturally loud in the fourth-floor hallway, echoing off the exposed brick walls he'd so carefully restored years earlier. The smell hit him immediately as the door swung open, but it wasn't the chemical odor he'd been expecting. Instead, it was something far more disturbing. The unmistakable scent of decay mixed with antiseptic, like a morgue trying to mask the smell of death with industrial cleaning products. Richard's stomach lurched as he called out Sarah's name, his voice cracking slightly in the suddenly thick air of the apartment. What he saw in those first few seconds defied every assumption he'd made about his tenant, his building, and the situation he thought he was investigating. The living room, which should have contained furniture, personal belongings, and the normal detritus of daily life, had been completely transformed into something that belonged in a medical facility or research laboratory. Stainless steel tables lined the walls, their surfaces gleaming under harsh, fluorescent lights that Sarah had installed to replace the apartment's original warm lighting fixtures. But it was what was on those tables that made Richard's knees buckle and his vision blur at the edges. Dozens of glass containers, each roughly the size of a large pickle jar, filled every available surface. The containers were filled with a clear, slightly viscous liquid, and floating in each one was something that Richard's mind initially refused to process. Human organs, hearts, kidneys, livers, sections of brain tissue, all suspended in what appeared to be some kind of preservative solution, each container meticulously labeled with dates, codes, and technical notations in Sarah's precise handwriting. The apartment's bedroom door stood open, revealing an even more horrifying scene. What had once been a sleeping area had been converted into an operating theater, complete with surgical lighting, monitoring equipment, and a steel table stained with substances Richard didn't want to identify. Medical equipment that belonged in a hospital, ventilators, heart monitors, surgical instruments laid out with military precision on sterile trays, filled every corner of the room. Richard stumbled backward, his construction worker instincts screaming at him to run, but his landlord responsibilities keeping him frozen in place. This was his building, his responsibility, and somehow this nightmare had been unfolding directly above his other tenants for months without his knowledge. The grinding sounds Mrs. Patterson had reported, the electrical problems, the chemical smells, everything suddenly made terrifying sense. A noise from the apartment's kitchen area snapped Richard out of his paralyzed state. Sarah Chen emerged from what had once been a normal residential kitchen, but her appearance was so dramatically changed that Richard barely recognized her. Gone was the soft-spoken graphic designer who had charmed him during her lease application. The woman standing before him wore scrubs that were stained with substances that made Richard's stomach churn, and her once kind eyes now held a cold, calculating expression that seemed to look right through him. Sarah showed no surprise at finding Richard in her apartment, no embarrassment at being discovered, no fear of consequences. Instead, she regarded him with the detached interest of a scientist observing an unexpected variable in a controlled experiment. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the nervous hesitancy that had characterized their recent interactions. It was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of human warmth. She explained with chilling matter-of-factness that Richard's timing was inconvenient, but not catastrophic. She had been expecting this moment for weeks, she said, ever since the fire department's chemical detection equipment had registered traces of her work. The building had served its purpose admirably, she continued, providing the perfect cover for her research activities. The other tenants had been unknowing participants in her experiments, their complaints about smells and sounds serving as valuable data points about the effectiveness of her containment procedures. Richard's mind reeled as Sarah casually revealed the scope of what had been happening in his building. The packages he'd noticed weren't medical supplies for legitimate research. They were specimens, harvested from sources she described with clinical detachment, but refused to detail. The electrical modifications hadn't been simple power theft. They were necessary to run the specialized equipment required for organ preservation and the surgical procedures she'd been performing in what was supposed to be a residential apartment. The water pressure problems that had plagued the building made horrible sense now. Sarah had been tapping into the building's water system, not just for additional supply, but for the constant cleaning and sterilization her activities required. The basement scorch marks had been caused by her disposal methods. She'd been using industrial-grade chemical processes to eliminate evidence. Processes that generated enough heat to damage the concrete floor below her apartment. As Sarah continued her casual explanation, Richard realized that she wasn't confessing. She was briefing him, as if he were a colleague or collaborator, rather than the building owner who had just discovered her horrific activities. She spoke about her research subjects and her specimen collection, with the same tone another tenant might use to discuss their houseplants or hobby collection. The complete disconnect between her clinical language and the monstrous reality surrounding them made Richard's skin crawl. The most chilling revelation came when Sarah mentioned the other tenants by name, discussing their routines, their health conditions, and their suitability for what she called future research opportunities. Mrs. Patterson's regular medical checkups for her diabetes, the graduate student's young age and healthy lifestyle, even old Mr. Kowalski's heart condition. Sarah had been cataloging information about every person in the building, treating them not as neighbors, but as potential resources for her grotesque work. Richard's horror deepened as he realized that Sarah's rent payments, always in crisp new bills, had likely been funded by selling her harvested specimens to buyers whose identity and purposes he didn't want to contemplate. The foreign currency mixed in with her last payment suggested an international network of buyers, a market for human organs and tissue that operated in the shadows of legitimate medical research and organ donation programs. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the apartment sent a jolt of terror through Richard. Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, a cold expression that never reached her eyes, and mentioned that she'd been expecting visitors. The footsteps stopped outside apartment 4B, and Richard heard the unmistakable sound of multiple people positioning themselves on either side of the door. Sarah's calm demeanor never wavered as she explained that Richard's inspection had created complications that required immediate resolution. Her associates, she said, were professionals who specialized in handling unexpected situations like his discovery of her work. They were experienced in cleaning up problems that could interfere with ongoing research projects, and they had arrived prepared to ensure that her activities could continue without further interruption. The apartment door, which Richard had left slightly ajar during his horrified exploration of the converted laboratory, suddenly swung wide open. 3 figures entered with the smooth efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They moved with purpose but without haste, their faces covered by surgical masks that matched Sarah's scrubs. Their eyes, the only feature Richard could see clearly, held the same cold professional detachment that had transformed his formerly timid tenant into something inhuman. Richard's construction worker instincts finally overrode his shocked paralysis. He lunged toward the apartment's large windows, the same windows that had been a selling point when Sarah had first toured the unit 18 months earlier. But his movement was anticipated, and strong hands grabbed his arms before he could reach the glass. The men who restrained him worked with medical precision, their grip firm but careful, as if they were handling valuable equipment rather than a human being. As Richard struggled against his captors, Sarah continued speaking in the same matter-of-fact tone, explaining that his discovery had accelerated her timeline but hadn't disrupted her essential work. The building would continue to serve its purpose, she said, though some modifications to the operation would be necessary. The other tenants might need to be relocated, she mused, or perhaps incorporated into the research program in more direct ways. The last thing Richard saw clearly was Sarah Chen reaching for a surgical instrument from one of her sterile trays, her movements as practiced and confident as a surgeon preparing for a routine procedure. The transformed apartment, with its gleaming tables and horrific specimens, began to blur as something sharp pricked his neck. His final coherent thought, as consciousness slipped away, was the devastating realization that he had unknowingly provided the perfect cover for a monster, and that his failure to act sooner had put every person in his beloved building in mortal danger. The discovery that would ultimately bring justice came not from Richard's confrontation with Sarah Chen, but from an unexpected source that had been watching the building for weeks. Detective Maria Santos of Portland Police Bureau's Major Crimes Unit had been investigating a series of missing persons cases that had baffled the department for over a year. The victims had nothing obvious in common, different ages, backgrounds, and neighborhoods, but Santos had noticed a disturbing pattern in their final known locations. Each person had last been seen within a 5-mile radius of Selwood, and all had disappeared during evening hours when they would have been walking alone. Santos had been conducting surveillance on several buildings in the area when Richard Morrison failed to return home that Tuesday evening. His disappearance triggered a welfare check that led officers to apartment 4B, where they discovered not only Richard's unconscious form, but the full scope of Sarah Chen's horrific operation. The woman who had presented herself as a freelance graphic designer was actually Dr. Sarah Chen, a disgraced surgeon who had lost her medical license in California 3 years earlier for conducting unauthorized experimental procedures on patients. The apartment that Richard had entered that morning was revealed to be the epicenter of an organ harvesting operation that spanned multiple states and connected to international black market networks. The specimens Richard had seen floating in preservation jars represented dozens of victims whose disappearances had gone unnoticed or been attributed to other causes. Street people, undocumented immigrants, elderly individuals without family. Sarah had targeted the most vulnerable members of society, people whose absence wouldn't immediately trigger police investigations. The sophisticated equipment found in the apartment wasn't stolen from hospitals, as investigators initially suspected, but had been purchased through a network of corrupt medical supply dealers who specialized in providing resources to unlicensed practitioners. The surgical suite Sarah had created in her bedroom was more advanced than many legitimate medical facilities, funded by the enormous profits from selling organs to desperate patients on international waiting lists who were willing to pay any price to live. Richard Morrison survived his encounter with Sarah Chen, though the psychological trauma would haunt him for years to come. The drug Sarah had used to incapacitate him was a paralytic agent commonly used in surgery, intended to keep him conscious but immobilized, while she decided how to handle his unexpected discovery. Police arrived before Sarah could implement whatever solution she had planned, and Richard was rushed to Oregon Health and Science University Hospital, where doctors worked for hours to counteract the effects of the paralytic compound. The investigation into Sarah's operation revealed the extent to which she had manipulated not just Richard, but the entire Selwood community. The packages delivered to her apartment contained not only medical supplies, but actual human specimens shipped from a network of collaborators across the country. The grinding sounds tenants had reported were bone saws and other surgical tools. The chemical smells were preservation solutions and sterilization compounds. The electrical problems had been caused by the massive power draw from refrigeration units, surgical lights, and monitoring equipment that no residential building was designed to support. The foreign currency found in Sarah's rent payment traced back to buyers in countries where organ transplantation laws were either non-existent or poorly enforced. Sarah had been selling hearts, kidneys, livers, and other organs for prices that ranged from $50,000 to over $200,000 per specimen, depending on the organ type and the urgency of the buyer's need. Conservative estimates suggested her operation had generated over $3 million in revenue. During the 18 months she had operated from Richard's building, the other tenants of the building were evacuated immediately and provided with extensive medical examinations to ensure they hadn't been exposed to dangerous chemicals or infectious materials. Mrs. Patterson's diabetes medication had been tampered with, investigators discovered, as Sarah had been using her as an unwitting test subject for experimental insulin formulations. The graduate students in 3C had been experiencing headaches and nausea, not from stress over their studies, but from exposure to chemical vapors that had been seeping through the building's ventilation system. Even Mr. Kowalski, the building's perpetual complainer, had been targeted by Sarah's predatory attention. His heart condition made him an ideal candidate for what Sarah's notes described as cardiac extraction research, and she had been slowly gathering information about his medical history and daily routines. The realization that all of the building's residents had been living directly beneath a serial killer's laboratory sent shockwaves through the tight-knit Selwood community. The legal proceedings against Sarah Chen became one of the most complex criminal cases in Oregon's history. Federal prosecutors charged her with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, mail fraud, and running a continuing criminal enterprise. State prosecutors added charges of desecration of human remains, practicing medicine without a license, and violating numerous public health and safety regulations. The evidence collected from her apartment filled an entire warehouse, including detailed records of her victims, financial transactions, and communications with her network of buyers and suppliers. Sarah's trial revealed the sophisticated nature of her operation and the cold calculation behind every aspect of her crime. She had chosen Richard's building specifically because of its isolated location, solid construction that would muffle sounds, and Richard's reputation as a landlord who respected tenant privacy. She had researched each prospective tenant before their arrival, looking for individuals who would be unlikely to investigate unusual activities or whose disappearance might go unnoticed. The psychological evaluation conducted for Sarah's trial painted a picture of a brilliant surgeon whose moral compass had been completely destroyed by greed and a god complex that viewed other human beings as nothing more than sources of biological materials. Expert witnesses testified that her meticulous record-keeping and clinical approach to murder suggested a complete disconnect from normal human empathy, making her one of the most dangerous criminals the justice system had ever encountered. Richard Morrison's building was condemned immediately after the discovery, requiring extensive decontamination and structural repairs before it could ever be habitable again. The financial impact devastated Richard, who lost not only his primary source of income, but faced potential lawsuits from former tenants and their families. His insurance company initially refused to cover the damages, arguing that the criminal activities constituted an exclusion under his policy terms. The community impact extended far beyond Richard's building. Property values in Selwood plummeted as news of the organ harvesting operation spread through local and national media. Other landlords found themselves facing increased scrutiny from tenants and city inspectors, with many implementing new background check procedures and more frequent property inspections. The case prompted changes to city building codes, requiring more robust inspection protocols for residential properties. The victims' families, once their loved ones were identified through DNA testing of the specimens found in Sarah's apartment, filed wrongful death lawsuits that ultimately bankrupted several organizations connected to the illegal organ trade. The medical supply companies that had sold equipment to Sarah faced federal investigations and criminal charges for their role in enabling her operation. Several executives were sentenced to prison terms for conspiracy and racketeering charges. Richard Morrison eventually rebuilt his life, though the trauma of his experience fundamentally changed his approach to property management and human relationships. He sold the condemned building to a developer who demolished it entirely, erecting a small memorial garden where the apartment complex had once stood. Richard used his portion of the insurance settlement to establish a non-profit organization focused on supporting missing persons investigations and improving safety. Protocols for residential properties. Sarah Chen was sentenced to death after a trial that lasted 8 months and featured testimony from over 200 witnesses. Her appeals process continued for years, but she ultimately was executed by lethal injection, a irony not lost on observers who noted that her final moments involved the same type of medical procedure she had used to end the lives of her victims. Her death brought closure to some families, but could never fully heal the trauma inflicted on the survivors and the community. The ripple effects of the case continued for years. Federal legislation was enacted, requiring more stringent oversight of medical supply purchases and creating databases to track suspicious patterns in organ-related commerce. The case became a textbook study in criminal psychology programs and prompted changes to medical licensing procedures designed to prevent disgraced practitioners from continuing their work in other jurisdictions. For Richard Morrison, the experience served as a harsh reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that the responsibility of providing shelter to others carries risks that extend far beyond financial considerations. His story became a cautionary tale shared among property managers and landlords, highlighting the importance of maintaining appropriate oversight without violating tenant privacy rights. The building that had once been Richard's pride and joy was gone forever, but the lessons learned from its destruction continued to protect other communities from similar predators. In the end, justice was served not just through Sarah Chen's punishment, but through the systemic changes that made it harder for such monsters to operate in the shadows of normal society. The price of that justice, paid in blood and trauma, served as a permanent reminder that vigilance against evil must be constant, even in the most seemingly peaceful neighborhoods. Sometimes the most dangerous threats come not from strangers lurking in dark alleys, but from the people we trust enough to call neighbors, tenants, and members of our community. Richard Morrison learned that lesson in the most terrifying way possible, and his survival ensured that others might be spared the same fate.